The rain hadn't stopped for 11 days when Thomas Merrick's cabin began its impossible sideways slide down the Otago hillside on the 23rd of April, 1873, whilst 27 other structures in the settlement collapsed or were swept away entirely. His dwelling tilted precisely 15 degrees into the slope and, anchored with techniques the other settlers had called complete madness, held firm against 3,000 cubic yards of moving earth. Inside, his pregnant wife Catherine and their 2 young daughters waited out the storm that would claim 14 lives across the South Island that fortnight, completely unaware that the very angle their neighbors had mocked for 18 months was the only reason they were still breathing. New Zealand's South Island goldfields had drawn Thomas Merrick from Yorkshire in 1864, but by 1871 the easily accessible gold was gone, and men who'd come seeking fortune were establishing permanent settlements in terrain that seemed determined to reject them. The Shotover River Valley, where Merrick staked his land grant of 43 acres, presented conditions that would have sent more sensible settlers back to Britain. Slopes averaging 38 degrees, rainfall exceeding 97 inches annually, and clay-rich soil that turned treacherous when saturated. The 12 families attempting to establish farms there faced earth that moved. Merrick was 34 when he first noticed the pattern. A man of few words who'd worked underground in the Yorkshire coalfields since age 11, he possessed what his wife called an awkward habit of watching things that don't seem worth watching. During the winter of 1871, whilst other settlers focused on clearing land and establishing basic shelters, he spent hours observing how water moved across the hillside after storms, marking subtle shifts in rock positions, noting which trees grew at angles and which stood straight. "You planning to count the bloody raindrops next, Thomas?" called out William Prescott, a former Royal Navy carpenter from Portsmouth who'd arrived the same year and was building his cabin on flatter ground 200 yards downslope. Prescott was 41, capable, and possessed the confidence of a man who'd survived 20 years at sea. His cabin would have 12-inch horizontal beams, proper right angles, and foundations dug to regulation depth, everything the Royal Engineers would have specified. "Rest of us are building homes whilst you're playing at being a natural philosopher." The criticism found support amongst the settlement. Margaret Thorpe, a widow from Kent running the provisional trading post, observed that Merrick's endless measurements served no purpose she could discern. "The man's got a pregnant wife and 2 little ones in a tent," she told anyone who'd listen, her received pronunciation carrying the authority of her late husband's former position as a colonial surveyor. "Winter's coming, and he's drawing diagrams in the mud like a madman." But Merrick had seen something the others hadn't. The hillside's geology told a story written in layers, compressed clay beneath 18 inches of topsoil, all resting at an angle that would have made any mining engineer nervous. When saturated, that clay became effectively frictionless. He'd watched smaller slides during winter storms, nothing catastrophic, just subtle movements that shifted fence posts by inches and caused saplings to lean. The hill wasn't stable. It was patient. By August 1871, when he finally began construction, his design violated every assumption his neighbors held about proper building. The foundation wasn't level, it was cut into the hillside at a 15-degree angle, with the uphill side buried 4 feet deep and the downhill side barely 2 feet below grade. The entire structure tilted backward into the slope, looking from any distance like a cabin that was falling over in slow motion. "Christ almighty, man, that's not a house. It's a bloody joke," said Robert Fraser, a Scottish sheep farmer from the Highlands whose own stone cottage sat on relatively level ground, a quarter-mile distant. Fraser was 56, grey-bearded, and had survived Highland clearances and 3 failed harvests. He knew hard country, and he knew foolishness when he saw it. "You'll have your furniture sliding downhill every morning. Your wife will murder you within a week." Merrick's response was characteristically brief. Possibly, the structure's peculiarities extended beyond its angle. Where other cabins used corner posts driven vertically into the ground, Merrick's posts angled 15 degrees from true vertical perpendicular to his tilted floor, not to the earth. He'd laboriously carved these posts from red beech, each one precisely shaped to bear weight along its length rather than at an angle. The uphill wall was partially buried, backed with stones mortared together, creating what amounted to a buttress against the hillside itself. "Understand this," he explained one afternoon to Reverend Edmund Walsh, the Anglican vicar who'd arrived from Dublin to minister to the scattered settlements. Walsh was 38, educated at Trinity College, and genuinely curious about Merrick's thinking, even if he privately considered it misguided. "If the hillside moves, it'll move as one piece. Clay layer beneath will slide like grease on glass once it's waterlogged enough. Every structure sitting atop that clay, every vertical foundation, every level floor will tilt and collapse as the ground shifts beneath it. And your solution is to build a structure that's already tilted?" Walsh asked, not unkindly. "The solution is to build a structure that moves with the hill, not against it," Merrick said. "Cabins anchored deep into stable earth uphill. When the surface layers slide, they slide past the foundation, not with it. The tilt keeps the structure's weight pressing backwards into the slope, not pulling away from it." Walsh considered this, "And if you're wrong, then I'll have built a very uncomfortable home for no reason," Merrick acknowledged. But if I'm right and build it level, I'll have killed my family. The theological implications of that statement troubled Walsh more than he cared to admit. If you're watching this because you value the kind of practical wisdom that kept people alive when there were no second chances, no rescue services arriving within minutes, and no building inspectors ensuring safety through regulation when survival depended entirely on understanding the land and having the courage to act on that understanding even when everyone around you said you were mad, then you'll want to hear how this story unfolds. Because what Thomas Merrick understood about physics, geology, and the difference between building for appearance and building for survival would prove itself in the most dramatic way possible. Construction took 4 months. Merrick worked largely alone, occasionally assisted by his wife Catherine when tasks required for hands. Catherine was 31, originally from Lancashire, and possessed the quiet resilience that characterized women who'd chosen to follow their husbands to the far side of the world, despite knowing full well the hardships that awaited. She'd lost their first child to typhoid aboard the ship that brought them from Britain, and she understood in her bones that survival here required accepting uncomfortable truths rather than comfortable illusions. The floor slopes, she observed on the day Merrick laid the interior boards. I can feel it. 3 inches over 12 feet, he confirmed. Marbles will roll. Tea will slosh if you fill cups too full. You'll adjust within a week. And if the others are right, if you've just built us a crooked house for no earthly reason. He looked at her then, his Yorkshire accent thickening as it did when he felt strongly about something. Kate, I've spent half my life underground watching men die because they ignored what the earth was telling them. Rock talks if you listen. This hill's talking, and it's saying it won't stay put when heavy rain comes. I'd rather our daughters grow up embarrassed by their father's crooked house than not grow up at all. She nodded once. Then we'll learn to live with slopes. The cabin's completed form baffled visitors. From downslope it appeared to be leaning backward alarmingly. From upslope it looked almost normal until you noticed the roof was at entirely the wrong angle. The interior required mental adjustment. Door frames tilted, window sills weren't level, and furniture needed wedges under the downhill legs. Merrick carved those wedges himself, dozens of them in different sizes, ensuring every table and chair sat level despite the sloping floor. Margaret Thorpe visited in November 1871, bringing supplies and undisguised curiosity. Inside the cabin, she stood in the center of the main room and slowly turned in a circle, her expression suggesting she was trying to solve a puzzle that had no solution. It makes me dizzy, she admitted. Everything looks wrong. How can you possibly live like this? You adjust, Catherine said simply. She was preparing tea, moving about the tilted kitchen with the ease of familiarity. First week was dreadful. Second week was merely awkward. By the third week, I stopped noticing. Now when I visit other cabins, they feel wrong to me. But the children, surely they'll grow up thinking this is normal. They'll grow up alive, Catherine replied, and there was steel beneath the Lancashire accent. That's what's normal here. Through that first summer and autumn, the Merrick cabin became a minor curiosity and major source of amusement. Visitors would bring small items, buttons, pebbles, coins, and place them on the floor to watch them roll downhill. Men would stand in the doorway and make jokes about being drunk without touching a drop. The children from other families were simultaneously fascinated and unsettled by a house where the laws of level didn't apply. My eldest won't sleep there, reported Henry Davidson, a bricklayer from Manchester whose own cabin sat on what he considered properly flat ground. Davidson was 43, methodical, and had built his home exactly as he'd built hundreds of structures in industrial Manchester: level foundation, plumb walls, right angles throughout. Says it gives him nightmares. Something about the house falling over. The house isn't falling over, Merrick said mildly. It's built exactly as it should be. Built to fall over. You mean, Davidson countered, not cruelly but with the certainty of a man who'd spent his life making things square and true. Tell me, Thomas, when you were mining in Yorkshire, did you dig your tunnels at 15-degree angles? When the seam ran at 15 degrees? Aye, Merrick replied. You followed the coal, not your preference for level. The conversation ended there. As most conversations with Merrick did, he'd made his point and saw no reason to elaborate. By winter 1872, the settlement had grown to 27 structures housing 12 families. Most followed conventional building level foundations, vertical walls, floors that didn't send your breakfast sliding. Prescott's carpentry was particularly admired. His cabin's corners met at perfect right angles, his floor level enough to serve as a carpenter's reference. When colonial officials visited in August, they cited Prescott's work as exemplary and made no mention of Merrick's tilted oddity beyond noting its unusual character. They're right, you know. Prescott told Merrick over drinks that evening that two men had developed a cordial relationship despite their philosophical differences about construction. Your craftsmanship's sound enough, but the fundamental design is balmy. What happens when you want to sell? Who's going to buy a house that makes them seasick? Don't plan to sell, Merrick said. Everyone plans to sell eventually. That's how settlements work. People come, people go, property changes hands. This property won't. Prescott studied him. You really think something bad's coming, don't you? Some great catastrophe that only you can see. I think the hillside moves when it's wet enough, Merrick said carefully. I think it's moved before, probably many times over centuries. And I think it'll move again, probably within our lifetimes, possibly within the next few years. That's not prophecy. That's geology. And the rest of us are doomed because we built sensible houses. The rest of you are at risk because you built houses that can't accommodate the reality of the terrain, Merrick corrected. There's a difference. The distinction was lost on Prescott, who changed the subject to more agreeable topics. The winter of 1872 brought heavy rain but no disasters. The spring lambing season was successful. Summer crops grew well. By autumn 1873, the settlement's concerns centered on ordinary problems: crop prices, supply ship schedules, the need for a proper school building. Margaret Thorpe's trading post had expanded to include a small post office. Reverend Walsh was conducting services in a structure that was optimistically called a chapel, though it was really just a large shed. Davidson and 2 other men were planning to build a proper flour mill come spring. The Merrick cabin remained the settlement's curiosity. Its tilt unchanged, its occupants apparently comfortable in their sideways existence. Catherine had given birth to a 3rd daughter in February 1873. At 3, she managed the household with efficiency, raised 3 girls under the age of 7, maintained a kitchen garden on the sloping terrain, and never complained about the tilted floors that still unsettled visitors. "Do you ever wonder if your husband's wrong?" asked Eleanor Prescott, William's wife, during a visit in March 1873. Eleanor was 38, originally from Surrey, and possessed a directness that Catherine appreciated even when it probed uncomfortable territory. "Every day," Catherine admitted, "but I also remember he predicted a tunnel collapse in Yorkshire 3 days before it happened. Mine owners ignored him. 7 men died. Thomas won't talk about it, but I know it's why he measures everything twice and trusts nothing that looks conventional." "That must be exhausting," Eleanor said. "Always waiting for disaster." "It's not waiting for disaster," Catherine corrected. "It's preparing for reality. There's a difference." April 1873 arrived with rain that seemed to have no interest in stopping. The first week brought 3 inches, the second week brought 5 more. By the third week, streams had overflowed, gardens were drowning, and the clay hillsides throughout the Shotover Valley had taken on the dark, saturated appearance that locals were beginning to recognize as ominous. On the 19th of April, Merrick walked the hillside above his cabin, checking the markers he'd placed 2 years earlier, stakes driven into the ground at precise intervals, their positions measured relative to fixed rock outcrops. What he found made his stomach tighten. The stakes had moved. Not dramatically, the largest displacement was only 3 inches over 50 feet, but they'd moved consistently in the same direction. Down the slope the clay layer was beginning to slide. He found Reverend Walsh at the chapel that afternoon. "You need to convince people to leave," Merrick said without preamble. "The hillside's moving. Another week of rain and it'll go." Walsh looked at him with the expression of a man who'd spent years ministering to worried parishioners and had learned to distinguish genuine danger from anxiety. "Thomas, it's been raining heavily. Everyone's concerned but moving." "You can't possibly know. I've measured it," Merrick interrupted. "Marker stakes I placed in 71. They've shifted 3 inches downslope. The clay layer saturated. It's happening exactly as I predicted." 3 inches over 2 years is hardly 3 inches in the last fortnight, Merrick corrected. "The movement's accelerating." Walsh was quiet for a moment. "Can you prove this to the others? Show them these measurements?" But they'll need to understand what they're seeing, and they'll need to trust that I've interpreted it correctly." "That," Walsh said gently, "is where you'll face difficulty. You've been predicting disaster for 2 years, Thomas. Eventually, people stop listening." That evening, Merrick attempted to call a settlement meeting. 7 adults attended. Prescott, Davidson, Fraser, and Margaret Thorpe listened politely as he explained the measurements, the geology, the risk. Fraser actually walked up to examine the markers with him the next morning, his Scottish pragmatism overcoming his skepticism long enough to verify that the stakes had indeed moved. "I'll grant you this is concerning," Fraser said, standing in rain that had soaked through both their coats. "But 3 inches, Thomas. You're asking families to abandon their homes and huddle together in Thorpe's trading post because of 3 inches of movement. I'm asking families to take reasonable precautions based on observable evidence. Reasonable to you, perhaps. To them, you're the man who built the crooked house and has been predicting catastrophe since the day he arrived. You understand why that's a problem." Merrick did understand. He understood perfectly. And he understood that nothing he could say would change their minds before the hillside made the decision for them. On the 22nd of April, the rain intensified. What had been merely heavy became torrential. Merrick watched the streams cutting new channels through saturated earth. He watched small debris slides on the hillside above. He watched the clay banks along the river road developing tension cracks, and he made a decision. "We're leaving," he told Catherine that evening, "taking the girls to Walsh's chapel. It's on solid ground, proper bedrock, well above the slide zone, and our home." She didn't argue. After 7 years of marriage, she knew when Thomas had moved from concern to certainty. Either it stands or it doesn't, but I'm not having our daughters inside it when the hillside goes. They packed essentials that night. Catherine made a game of it for the children, calling it an adventure, a special camping trip to visit Reverend Walsh. The two older girls accepted this easily enough. The infant, just 2 months old, simply slept. On the morning of the 23rd, Merrick went to every cabin within 500 yards of his own. He explained the cracks he'd observed. He described the accelerating marker movement. He offered to help move families to higher ground, and he was turned down by every household. "It's been raining for 3 weeks and nothing's happened," Prescott said, not unkindly. "I appreciate your concern, Thomas. Truly I do. But I'm not dragging my family through this weather to huddle in a drafty chapel because you think the hill might move." "Not might," Merrick said. "Will. Then we'll deal with it when it happens," Prescott replied, with the confidence of a man who'd weathered actual storms at sea and survived. Davidson's response was blunter. "Mate, if I evacuated every time someone predicted disaster, I'd have never left Manchester. Rain's supposed to stop tomorrow according to the almanac. We'll be fine." Only Margaret Thorpe seemed genuinely conflicted. "My husband was a surveyor," she said, standing in the doorway of her trading post whilst rain drummed on the corrugated iron roof. "He taught me to respect men who measure carefully, but he also taught me that certainty and accuracy aren't the same thing." "You're certain, Thomas?" "I'm not convinced you're accurate." By noon on the 23rd, the Merrick family was settled in Walsh's chapel along with the Reverend himself. The building sat on a granite outcrop a quarter-mile from the main settlement, well above the Claridge slopes that concerned Merrick. From its windows, they could see most of the valley, including the tilted roof of their own cabin. "How long do we wait?" Walsh asked. "Until it happens or until I'm proved wrong," Merrick said. "Won't be more than a day or two either way. The cracks are widening every hour." At 8:17 on the evening of April 23rd, Thomas Merrick's understanding of geology proved catastrophically correct. The slide began not with a roar but with a sound like tearing fabric, the noise of earth. Separating from earth as 3,000 cubic yards of clay-saturated topsoil lost its battle with gravity, what had been a hillside became, in the span of 40 seconds, a slow-motion river of earth moving at approximately 4 feet per second downslope. Prescott's cabin, with its perfect right angles and level foundation, tilted backward as the ground beneath its front wall dropped away. The structure tried to accommodate the change, timber creaking, joints separating. Then the downhill foundation posts lost their purchase entirely, and the building's front half collapsed inward, roof beams snapping, walls folding like a closing book. Prescott and his wife made it out the back door with their 3 children. Their neighbors, the Harrisons, were not as fortunate. Their cabin collapsed completely, trapping them inside for nearly an hour before others could dig them free. Both parents survived with injuries. Their son Thomas, age 9, did not. Davidson's brick structure should have been stronger. It wasn't. Brick is magnificently strong in compression, nearly useless in tension. When the foundation shifted, the walls developed cracks that propagated in seconds. The entire west wall came down. Davidson's wife was struck by falling masonry. She survived but lost the use of her left arm. Fraser's stone cottage, built with Highland stubbornness on what he'd been certain was stable ground, broke apart as the earth beneath it moved at different rates. The massive foundation stones that should have anchored it became weapons as they tumbled downslope. Fraser himself received a compound fracture of the leg trying to evacuate his livestock. Across the settlement, the pattern repeated. Structures built according to conventional wisdom, with level foundations and vertical walls, found those foundations tilting and those walls collapsing as the earth beneath them moved. Of 27 buildings in the slide zone, 23 were destroyed or severely damaged. 3 that survived were on bedrock. The last was Thomas Merrick's tilted cabin. From the chapel, in rain and darkness broken only by intermittent lightning, they watched the disaster unfold. Catherine held their infant daughter and tried to prevent the 2 older girls from seeing too much. Walsh prayed aloud in Latin, then in English, then in what might have been Irish. Merrick stood at the window, watching his predictions become reality, and felt absolutely no satisfaction whatsoever. "We need to help them," he said, and started toward the door. "Wait," Walsh said. "Is it still moving? Can we safely? It's slowing." Clay's reached a new angle of repose. "We go now." The next 3 hours were a blur of rain, mud, and desperate activity. Merrick, Walsh, and several men who'd been outside the slide zone worked to extract families from collapsed structures. They improvised stretchers from doors and blankets. They established a triage area in Thorpe's trading post, which had survived by virtue of sitting on solid ground. Catherine, despite having given birth just 2 months earlier, worked alongside 2 other women to tend the injured. By midnight, they'd accounted for everyone except the Harrison boy, whom they found at 2 in the morning beneath the remnants of his family's roof. Merrick helped carry the small body to the chapel whilst his own daughters slept on pews inside, oblivious to the cost of their father's vindication. The morning of April 24th revealed the full extent of the catastrophe. A scar 200 yards wide and 400 yards long marked where the hillside had shed its skin. Houses that had stood the previous evening were now scattered ruins. Personal possessions, furniture, clothes, tools, children's toys lay half buried in mud. And in the center of the devastation, tilted backward into the slope at precisely 15 degrees, utterly alone in its survival, stood Thomas Merrick's cabin. Prescott approached him at mid-morning. The carpenter's hands were bandaged. He'd torn them badly, pulling timber off his wife and children. His face was gray with exhaustion and something that might have been shame. "Your house stood," he said. You tried to warn us. I should have listened." Merrick looked at him then. This man who'd mocked his building methods, whose family had survived only through fortune and quick reflexes. "You made the best decision you could with the information you believed. That's all anyone can do. You had better information. We should have believed you." "Why would you?" Merrick asked. Carpenter from Portsmouth with 20 years' experience, or former coal miner from Yorkshire claiming the Earth's going to move. "You made the rational choice based on your experience. The problem wasn't your logic. It was that the situation required different experience than you had." They stood together in silence, looking at the devastation. Finally, Prescott asked, "How did you know? Really know? Not just guess?" "Saw a tunnel collapse in Yorkshire when I was 17, Merrick said. "Compressed shale over wet clay, just like this hillside. Management said it was stable. Engineer who'd actually worked the geology said it would fail. Management ignored him. Tunnel came down on a Tuesday afternoon, 7 dead, including the engineer. I was supposed to be working that shift, but I'd listened to the man. Called in sick, and you've been watching for similar conditions ever since." "Can't not watch," Merrick admitted. "Once you've seen what happens when people ignore geology, you can't pretend the ground beneath you is more solid than it actually is." The settlement's recovery was slow and bitter. Families crowded into surviving structures. The colonial government sent supplies and emergency funds. Engineers arrived to assess the hillside stability and declared most of the original settlement location unsuitable for building. New construction would need to move to higher ground or employ specialized foundations, which meant that nearly everyone needed to rebuild somewhere else, except Thomas Merrick. His cabin had survived so completely that engineers asked to examine it. They measured the tilt 14 degrees, 11 minutes. They studied the buried buttressed uphill wall. They noted how the tilted orientation kept the structure's weight pressing into stable ground uphill rather than pulling away. They observed how angled floor and walls let surface layers slide past without transferring shear forces. "This is remarkable work," said Richard Thornhill, the senior engineer who'd supervised mining in Wales. "Unconventional, but the principles are sound." "Did you study engineering formally?" "Studied staying alive in coal mines," Merrick replied. "Turns out it's similar." Thornhill spent 2 hours documenting the construction. "May I publish these findings?" "Other settlements faced similar terrain," Merrick shrugged. "Do as you like. I'm no inventor. Just built what made sense." The report Thornhill produced adaptive foundation systems for unstable terrain. A case study from the Otago goldfields appeared in the Transactions of the New Zealand Institute in 1874. It included detailed drawings, soil mechanics analysis, and recommendations for similar terrain. Colonial engineers referenced it for decades. Several settlements adopted modified versions. Thomas Merrick never claimed credit. When asked about the famous tilted cabin, he'd simply note it hadn't fallen down, which was all he'd aimed for. The settlement rebuilt over the following year. Most families moved to higher ground. The Prescotts stayed, building on bedrock with foundations incorporating lessons from disaster. Davidson left for Dunedin, his confidence shaken. Fraser rebuilt with foundations reaching bedrock. Accepting Highland experience didn't translate to New Zealand. Young Thomas Harrison was buried in a new cemetery. His headstone read, "Thomas Harrison, 1864 a 1873, beloved son." Afterward, Harrison's father approached Merrick. "You tried to warn us," he said, grief carved into every line. "I did," Merrick acknowledged. "We had your word. That should have been reason enough. My boy died because I trusted conventional wisdom over empirical observation." There was nothing Merrick could say to that, so he said nothing. The Merrick cabin stood another 43 years, still tilted at 15 degrees. Catherine raised 3 daughters there, teaching them houses didn't have to be level to be safe, they had to be appropriate to their terrain. Thomas maintained it carefully, checking markers each spring. When he died in 1909, his obituary noted his role pioneering adaptive foundation techniques. Catherine lived until 1921, dying in the same cabin. Their daughter Sarah inherited it and maintained it until 1916, when she moved to Wellington. She donated the timber to the Otago Museum, where sections remain on display. Merrick Cabin Foundation, circa 1871 to 1872. Example of early adaptive construction techniques for unstable terrain. If you found value in understanding how one man's willingness to trust observation over convention, to build for reality rather than appearance, and to accept ridicule rather than risk his family's lives led to innovations that protected thousands of people in subsequent decades. If you believe that traditional knowledge and practical wisdom deserve to be preserved and studied rather than forgotten, then I'd ask you to consider subscribing to this channel. We're documenting the techniques, the decisions, and the hard-won understanding that kept colonial settlers alive in terrain that seemed determined to kill them. Every subscription helps preserve these stories before they're lost entirely to time. The broader lesson from Merrick's cabin extends beyond construction. Following the 1873 slide, Engineers across New Zealand and Australia reassessed their assumptions. The notion that structures must be level and vertical was revealed as cultural preference rather than engineering necessity. By the 1880s, the New Zealand Public Works Department issued guidelines incorporating Merrick's design elements. In 1889, landslides in Tasmania destroyed 43 buildings but spared 7 built using modified Merrick principles. By 1900, what had been Merrick's peculiar obsession became accepted practice. Engineering manuals included adaptive foundations. Colonial building codes acknowledged that level and vertical weren't universal requirements. Catherine, in 1919, reflected, "Thomas didn't build that house to prove a point. He built it because he'd watched 7 men die in Yorkshire and couldn't bear his daughters meeting the same fate. He was difficult sometimes, always measuring, but I'd rather have raised my daughters in a crooked house with a difficult father than lost them to a straight house built by a conventional thinker." The tilted cabin's legacy extends to modern engineering. The principles Merrick employed: foundations that accommodate terrain movement, structures that yield to forces they cannot resist, anticipated modern seismic base isolation by nearly a century. The preserved cabin sections in the Otago Museum still receive visits from engineering students. In 2011, following the Christchurch earthquakes, engineers re-examined Merrick's approach, noting how his intuitive understanding preceded formal engineering principles. That tension between what looks right and what works correctly, between conventional wisdom and empirical observation, defines human decision-making. Merrick chose empiricism over convention, accepting ridicule over risk. His neighbors chose differently, with tragic consequences. Thomas Merrick built a house that looked wrong and functioned correctly. His neighbors built houses that looked correct and functioned fatally. The difference wasn't intelligence or experience, it was the willingness to trust observation over convention, to prioritize survival over appearance, to accept that understanding the ground beneath your feet matters more than maintaining others' approval. That lesson remains as relevant now as it was then.